Among the most read books in the entire history of Western spiritual literature is one written 15 centuries ago. But it wasn't written to be read. It was written to be prayed, every line, from beginning to end, addressed only to God. Its name, Confessions. Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, is its author, and its opening line already sums up the whole book. In Latin, Fecisti nos ad te, Domine, et inquietum est cor nostrum donec requiescat in te. In English, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Let's picture the scene. A middle-aged bishop dictates these words aloud to a secretary in a room lit only by an oil lamp. The person sitting there isn't the one he's explaining his life to. He speaks to God the way someone prays alone out loud, and it just happens that someone is there writing down every word. That alone reshapes everything people think about this book. A locked drawer was never where it belonged. While the author was still alive, this text was already circulating, copied by hand, read by thousands, and even so it never changed its addressee from beginning to end. Beneath the pen, dry parchment, in the air the faint scratch of ink. The bishop's house is silent at that hour, and only the crickets outside still have anything to say. Here's a quick question. Have you ever held a copy of Saint Augustine's Confessions in your hands, even if you never finished it? Answer in the comments with a yes or a no, then read what shows up there. The same chapter has stopped many readers in their tracks, in different years, in homes far apart from one another, with no coordination at all. Do you have a prayer request tucked away? Leave that too, a restless heart with no clear reason, an old doubt with no answer. This book has reached millions of people 15 centuries after it was written, even though Augustine never had a single reader in mind. Listening on your phone right now? Then do the same. Carry this story forward. Swipe the comment field to the left, and a button called Hype appears. One tap sends this story to someone who hasn't heard it yet. Later on, a voice never identified says 2 words to Augustine that change the rest of his life. Stay with us to hear further along what he himself heard. The saint of theology textbooks, the most quoted author after the apostles, present in every seminary library. That's how almost everyone knows Augustine. But this, almost nobody knows. One detail goes unnoticed. The most personal book he ever wrote doesn't have a single paragraph addressed to the reader. No introduction, no dear friend, no line like, "I write this so you may understand." From beginning to end, he speaks only to God. No one but him was ever meant to hear that conversation, and that's exactly what 15 centuries later, today's readers are still doing. The answer to how an ambitious professor of rhetoric, far from God, became someone who spoke to no one but him lies in a small town in North Africa, almost 40 years before this book existed. Saint Augustine was born in Thagaste, in North Africa, on the 13th of November, 354, more than 1600 years before this 28th of August became the day the Church remembers his death. The town stood in the Roman province of Numidia and is known today as Souk Ahras in Algeria. As for his father Patricius, he was a pagan, converting to Christianity only shortly before his death. A story already well known, kept on another day of the church calendar, is that of the Christian mother who had prayed for years for her son's conversion. Today it's his turn. Augustine goes off to study rhetoric in Carthage. History never recorded the name of the woman he began living with there at 17. She was his concubine, a term for stable unions outside formal marriage, socially accepted among students and teachers not yet in a position for an official marriage. The son born around 372 was named Adeodatus, meaning given by God. The union lasted around 15 years. At 19, reading a single book would change the course of his life. It was called Hortensius, written by Cicero and a lost work today of which only fragments survive, quoted by other ancient authors. It was this reading that awakened in him a love for philosophy and the pursuit of truth. It wasn't a book of theology or of faith. It was a work of philosophy by an author who had been dead for centuries. And yet, It was this book that first opened a question rhetoric alone had never made Augustine ask. What in the end is truth, and is it worth spending an entire life in pursuit of it? Decades later, already a bishop writing the Confessions, Augustine would credit this lost book with starting it all. It was in this same period that he joined the Manichaeans, a sect of Persian origin that divided the world between a god of good and a god of evil, contending even for the human body. The promise was a bold one, to explain the problem of evil through reason alone, with no need for faith at all. For a young man who already knew how to win any public argument, it was a doctrine hard to turn down. It was a sincere search, even if a mistaken one. Augustine didn't abandon his mother's faith out of laziness. He abandoned it because, in his mind, the Christianity of that time still had no good enough answer for the question that tormented him most: where evil comes from if God is good and all-powerful. It was in search of that answer, not in flight from God, that Augustine would spend nearly 9 years within Manichaeism. He taught rhetoric in Thagaste, then in Carthage. In 383, he left for Rome. From there to Milan, where he took up the imperial chair of rhetoric, the most coveted academic post in the entire Western Roman Empire for a teacher. The Carthage of those years had a harbor full of ships arriving from all across the Mediterranean, heat rising off the stones at midday, rooms full of young men reciting speeches aloud, training to win over entire crowds through the sheer force of their words. Students paid to learn how to win any argument, on any subject, whether they were right or not. It was in this world that Augustine excelled, a world of words used to win arguments, not to pray. In everyone's eyes, Augustine had achieved everything an ambitious young man could want. A son, a highly sought-after chair, disciples repeating his own lines all across the city. On the inside, he had no peace at all. It was like this, brilliant on the outside and restless within, that he arrived in Milan. And it was in Milan, listening to a bishop preach, that the gap between those two things finally began to close. Milan, summer of the year 386. Augustine no longer feels like a Manichaean, but he still has nothing solid to stand on. For months he's been attending the sermons of Bishop Ambrose, who taught an allegorical reading of the Old Testament, finding in the very same texts the Manichaeans dismissed as crude and contradictory, layers of meaning Augustine never expected to find there. Something inside him slowly begins to give way. His mother, who had also come to live near him in Milan, arranged a formal marriage for her son during this time. A bride only 10 years old, a common age for betrothal back then, but still below the minimum age for marriage, which meant Augustine had to wait 2 years. To honor the commitment, he sent back to Africa the woman he had lived with for 15 years, the mother of his own son, Adeodatus. Decades later, already a bishop, he would write of that separation that his heart, so attached to her, was wounded and bled for a long time. Unable to wait alone through the 2 years until the marriage, he took in the meantime another temporary companion. Torn between what he already knew to be right and what he still couldn't let go of, Augustine made in this same period the prayer he himself would later call shameful: "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." The arguments had already won inside him long before. He knew his mother's faith made more sense than any alternative he had ever studied, Manichaeism included. What was missing wasn't knowledge. What was missing was wanting it fully, without reservation, without part of him still clinging to his old life. And something still held him in place. The sheer habit of years, the life he had already built, the pride of a man who had always won every argument and didn't know how to lose this one. Augustine would later describe that moment as a war within his own body, the new will pulling one way, old habit pulling the other, and him standing in the middle, unable to move toward either. It wasn't the first time a man had come close to faith and pulled back at the last step. What sets that afternoon apart from thousands of similar moments of hesitation throughout history is that this one didn't end in retreat. One day that summer, Augustine leaves the house and walks alone into the garden. He sits down beneath a fig tree. The heat of the afternoon still hangs heavy in the air. Around him, the low hum of summer insects, the dark green of the fig tree's leaves, the dry earth beneath his feet. And there, no longer able to hold back what he had been carrying for years, he begins to weep. Weeping he would later describe as the loudest and most bitter of his entire life. He wasn't weeping over a loss. He was weeping because he still couldn't give what he already knew he needed to give. Decades of rhetoric had taught Augustine to control every word before any audience. And there, alone beneath a tree, he couldn't control anything at all. It's at this moment that he hears a voice. It comes from a nearby house, a child, a boy or a girl. No one has ever been able to say for certain, playing some game that kept repeating the same two words, sung again and again and again. Take up and read, take up and read. Augustine had never heard that chant in any game, before or after that day. Sitting there with no strength left to keep weeping, he understood those words as a command coming from God. He got up, ran back to where he had left a book with the letters of St. Paul, opened it at random, and his eyes fell on the letter to the Romans, chapter 13. Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in quarreling and jealousy. Clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't need to read another word. There was no more debate, no more argument, no more putting it off. All the resistance of so many years fell away at once, like someone setting down a weight they had carried for so long they had forgotten it was even there. Augustine, already a bishop, would recount that same moment in detail many years later, in Book 8 of the Confessions, the very book that opened this video. It was he who wrote decades later every word of this scene: the garden, the fig tree, the weeping, the child's voice. No one else was there to tell it. It wasn't a new argument that settled 9 years of searching. It was a single sentence, overheard by chance, and received as a direct answer. It's that very kind of conversation, between a restless soul and a God who answers, that Augustine would spend the rest of his life trying to put into words. At the Easter Vigil the following year, 387, the most solemn night on the Christian calendar, between Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday, Augustine was baptized by Ambrose in Milan. He wasn't baptized alone. Beside him into the same water went also his son Adeodatus, by then a young man and his closest friend of a lifetime, Alypius. 3 different stories, one water, the same night. Decades of resistance, of arguments, of another person's tears came to an end that single night, with 3 men stepping out soaked from the same font. The conversion seemed like the end of a long search. It was, in truth, only the beginning of another one, the search of a man who still had to discover what to do with the rest of the life he had just handed over. Back in Africa, after his baptism in Milan, Augustine founded in Thagaste a small semi-monastic community devoted to prayer and study, a first attempt at communal life that years later would become a written rule. 5 years after that baptism, in 391, Augustine was visiting the city of Hippo, today Annaba, in Algeria, in North Africa, with no plan at all to stay. He was dragged quite literally by the congregation itself before the local bishop, and ordained a priest right there against his will, a common practice at the time when an entire crowd would acclaim a name and the bishop would give in to popular pressure. He became coadjutor bishop of Hippo around 395 and, the following year, 396 bishop in his own right. He governed the diocese for 34 years, until the end of his life. Those were 34 years of letters, of disputes, of the faithful knocking at the bishop's door, and even so, in the middle of all of it, Augustine never stopped writing. As bishop, Augustine fought 3 great doctrinal battles, and each one answered a question that ordinary Christian life also needed answered. It was in fighting these 3 battles, letter after letter, sermon after sermon, that much of Augustine's entire theological work was born, not theory written in cold blood, but a direct response to those who knocked at his door disagreeing with him. The first was against the Manichaeans, the very sect Augustine himself had followed for nearly 9 years before his conversion. Now from within the church, he wrote against the very doctrine he had once defended in public, the idea of two gods at war, one good and one evil, contending even for the human body. No one could argue against that doctrine with more authority than a bishop who had lived it from the inside and knew exactly where it promised more than it could deliver. The second battle was against the Donatists, a schism that had divided the church in North Africa for generations. At stake was a question any ordinary believer might ask: does a sacrament remain valid if the priest administering it had in the past betrayed the faith under persecution? The Donatists said no, that the holiness of the sacrament depended on the holiness of the one administering it. Augustine answered that the sacrament belongs to Christ, not to the priest, and remains valid even when administered by unworthy hands. It's the same answer the Church still gives today, whenever a believer asks whether their own confession or their own baptism counts for less because of an imperfect priest. The third was against the Pelagians, who denied that God's grace was necessary for salvation, arguing that human effort alone was enough. It was the most personal battle of the three. No one knew better than Augustine, who had spent 9 years bound to a sect and even more years bound to his own will, just how far effort alone had always fallen short. It was in fighting this idea that he earned the title by which the Church still knows him today, Doctor of Grace. In 1298, almost 900 years after his death, Pope Boniface VIII declared him one of the first 4 doctors of the Latin Church, a title given to teachers whose doctrine became a reference point for all the faithful. Alongside Augustine came Ambrose, the bishop who baptized him, Jerome and Gregory the Great. It was already as bishop, between 397 and the year 400 or 401, that Augustine wrote the Confessions, the book that opened this video. The book has 13 parts. The first 9 tell the story of his life, from childhood to his conversion in the garden in Milan. The last 4 leave narrative behind and turn into pure reflection on memory, time, and the book of Genesis. And all 13, from beginning to end, are addressed to the same one, not the reader. God, this isn't a figure of speech, it's grammar. Every part is written in the second person, the way someone speaks while looking straight at another. The book's opening line, the one heard at the start of this video, doesn't say, "Here is my life." It says, "You have made us, Lord, for yourself." From the first paragraph to the last, across hundreds of pages, Augustine never changes who he's speaking to. He keeps speaking to God even when describing his own childhood, even when confessing his own faults, even when discussing philosophy. Scholars describe this book as the first spiritual autobiography of the West, not because some committee decided it, but because no one has found, before it, anything quite like it. And it became the model for an entire literary genre that would follow. Every book in which someone examines their own conscience in search of God has a root in this 4th century text. Augustine wrote another great book as bishop, besides the Confessions. Rome was sacked by Alaric's Visigoths in 410. For many people at the time, Roman or not, Christian or not, it felt as if the very center of the world had given way. Pagans, still numerous within the empire, raised a direct accusation against the church. The city had fallen because the world had abandoned the old gods for the God of the Christians, and the fall was the offended God's response. It was in answering that accusation that Augustine spent 13 years writing The City of God, distinguishing what he called the city of God, eternal, from the earthly city, passing, no empire, however long it lasted, deserved the faith that belonged to God alone. It was one of the greatest intellectual efforts of all late antiquity. A bishop, running an entire diocese, settling disputes, answering letters, and still writing year after year, one of the most influential books in the whole of Western political philosophy. The argument outlived the very cause that gave rise to it. The specific accusation that made him pick up his pen was long since forgotten, and the book written to answer it is still read today. There is still a third text, shorter than the other two and more lasting than either of them. Before it was the rule of any order, it was a letter of guidance, the document that lays out how a religious community should live, written by Augustine for the small community of clergy who lived with him in the monastery of the Bishop's Garden in Hippo. He never even planned to found an order at all, and yet this text would become the first monastic rule of the West. In the Middle Ages, the rule of Saint Augustine was adopted by regular canons, among them the Premonstratensians, founded by Saint Norbert. In the 13th century, the Dominicans adopted it too. The order of Thomas Aquinas still follows to this day a rule written by Augustine, not by Dominic de Guzman. It was also in the 13th century that various groups of hermits scattered across Europe united under this same rule, forming what became the Order of Saint Augustine proper. Today, more than 1600 years after it was written for a handful of clergy in a backyard in North Africa, that same rule still guides the lives of around 50,000 religious men and women around the world, gathered into dozens of different congregations, all following the same pages written for a community so small it didn't even have a name. Among those who once wore that habit, the tunic proper to Augustinian religious, is the most unexpected name in this whole story. Martin Luther entered the Order of Saint Augustine in 1505. He lived under Augustine's rule. He signed his own letters as Martin Luther, Augustinian, up until 1521, and wore the order's habit until 1524. The University of Wittenberg, where he taught, had Augustine of Hippo as its patron saint. Luther inherited the theology too, not just the habit. To build his doctrine of justification, the axis of the entire Protestant Reformation, he leaned heavily on Augustine's theology of grace, the very same theology Augustine had built more than 1,000 years earlier against the Pelagians. Luther never saw himself as breaking with Augustine, he saw himself as recovering him. The man the Church celebrates today as the Doctor of Grace shaped, without ever knowing it, the monk who would pull the Church toward the deepest division of the last 1,000 years, using to do it Augustine's own words about the grace of God. A rule written in a backyard for a handful of men made it through the entire Middle Ages and was still alive enough 1,100 years later to shape the century that would split Christian Europe in two. After more than 3 decades as bishop nearing the end, Augustine kept writing and dictating, almost without pause. What survives of everything he wrote is, to this day, the largest body of work to reach us from any author of the whole of antiquity. Around 5 million words, gathered into roughly 100 books and treatises, 300 letters, 600 sermons. Most of it dictated aloud to secretaries, often answered on the spot, letters from the faithful, from heretics, from other bishops. It's worth noting the contrast. Almost all of it, the treatises, the sermons, the 300 letters, was written for someone to answer, for a community to hear, for an opponent to be persuaded. Only one book, out of millions of words, was written for God alone to hear. And that's the one out of all of them that the most people still read today. The most repeated image of Augustine in stained glass and prints all over the world shows a boy on a beach trying to empty the sea with a shell, pouring the water into a hole in the sand. According to tradition, Augustine asks the boy what he's doing, and the boy answers that it would be easier to empty the entire sea than for the human mind to grasp the mystery of God. It's a beautiful image and worth telling, but it isn't an episode from the Confessions or from any text of Augustine's own. The oldest source found is more than 800 years old, written by a 13th century Dominican friar, long after the saint's death. It's tradition, not biography. And maybe that's exactly why it has stayed alive for so long, because it still feels true even though it never happened. The saint's traditional iconography carries another symbol too, more understated than the boy and the shell. A heart on fire, pierced by an arrow, an image of his own conversion, of a heart that resisted for years, and when it finally gave way completely. It's because of this same restlessness before mystery that the Church holds him today as patron of theologians, and also of printers, those who multiply books like the ones he wrote. In popular tradition, without firm historical grounding, he's also remembered as patron of brewers. The year 430 arrived with the Vandals, an Arian people at war with Rome, laying siege to Hippo. Augustine, already ill, spent the last months of his life watching, from the city walls, the devastation around him, and urging the people to hold on. From up there you could see the smoke of foreign camps on the horizon, and hear at night the heavy silence of a city that didn't know if it would see another morning. He died on the 28th of August of that year, at 75 years old, in the third month of the siege. The church's memory today keeps exactly that day. Shortly after his death, the Vandals withdrew for a short while. They came back and burned the city. Tradition preserves one detail. They spared the cathedral and the bishop's library, where most of his manuscripts were kept. There isn't a single contemporary source that confirms this for certain, but it's an old tradition, repeated for centuries, and perhaps it's true that the fire, coming so close to so many words written only for God, drew back as well. His body, however, didn't stay in Hippo. To escape the Vandal destruction, it was removed within those same centuries and taken to Sardinia, then part of the Byzantine world. Around the year 720, a Lombard king named Liutprand purchased the relics and brought them to Pavia, south of Milan. In 723, the bones were laid in the Basilica of San Pietro in Ciel d'Oro. There, over the centuries that followed, the exact location of the body inside the basilica itself slowly faded from memory. A marble monument with more than 150 carved figures had already stood there for generations, raised in honor of a saint whose exact body no one could any longer point to beneath the church's own floor. Only on the 1st of October, 1695, stonemasons working in the crypt found hidden beneath the floor slabs a marble box. The crypt's air, cold and still for centuries, torchlight flickering over the dust raised by their picks. Inside it, more boxes. In the last one, bones, fragments of wood, ancient glass. Men who didn't even know what they were looking for found what the whole city, centuries before, had sworn never to lose track of. A body hidden beneath the floor of the very church that venerated it, forgotten for generations by the same people who should have kept its memory. A book written to have no reader at all, only God as its addressee. The two most precious things Augustine left behind reached, each in its own way, eyes that were never the intended ones. The body, hands that only meant to fix a flaw. The book, millions of people Augustine never had in mind while writing it. Go back for a moment to the opening line of this video. You have made us, Lord, for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Augustine wrote that about his own life, but the line isn't only about his life. Where is your heart restless? What is it chasing, never quite satisfied? Maybe it's chasing work, maybe it's chasing approval, rest, an answer that never fully arrives. Augustine ran that way too, for years. After rhetoric, after a sect that promised to explain everything, after a career the whole world envied. None of it on its own ever settled anything. It took Augustine his whole youth to reach that surrender, and he lived more than 40 years after it. And even as bishop, even as doctor of the church, even as the author of 5 million words, he never stopped writing the same way, like someone speaking to someone who really is there, listening. Maybe the most sincere prayer isn't the best written one. Maybe it's the one that forgets anyone. Besides, God might be listening too. You don't need to write 5 million words to pray like that. You only need one thing, to forget for a moment that there's an audience. If this story touched you, share it with someone whose heart is restless too, searching for rest and finding it nowhere. Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, pray for us.